Thank you, Ashley, for reminding us of what we talked about last Sunday. And I'm excited to be sitting here together with my wife, Arlene, and my nephew, Joel Thiessen. And if you're worried about our distancing, we're all part of the same household. And so you can relax. We're playing by the rules. The account that we looked at last week was from Matthew chapter 27 and 28, the account of the resurrection. And if you remember, and as Ashley reminded us, that the main part of this story was about these three women. The women that had been there when Jesus was crucified. They had been witness to the burial when Joseph laid him in the tomb, and they were also there at the resurrection. If you read chapters 27 and 28, you'll have noted that there was another story playing in the background. And the story was about the religious leaders. And the religious leaders, already before the resurrection, they were concerned that the disciples would go to the tomb, steal the body, and make up a story about the resurrection. And so they asked that guards would be posted at the tomb. And then after the resurrection and the experience of the women at the tomb, then these same leaders, they got together in a meeting. And then they also had a meeting with the guards. And they paid the guards money to tell a different story about what happened at the tomb on that Easter morning. So we have two stories playing out. The story of the women, but then in the background is also this other story, and a fabricated story, or so we think. But Joel and Arlene, often, almost every story has two sides to it. And how can I be sure that I'm on the side of truth on this story? Joel, you a couple of years ago went through a journey and did a lot of thinking, and you made a radical switch on terms of the side of truth.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that you're here today. And so you're going to guide us in a discussion about how can I be sure that I'm on the side of truth about what actually happened that Easter morning. So start us off, Joel.
If you want to know if you're on the side of truth, you really just have to ask yourself the question, am I willing to follow the evidence where it leads me? Because all of the evidence points to the resurrection. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge why we're here and what we're doing. And I want to read from Psalm 22, which is a messianic psalm. And the last lines of this psalm, in which David prophesies about the coming Messiah, he says, "Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it." And that's what we're here for today, is to celebrate the fact that Jesus has done it. And we are the generation which is now born. And so, yeah, we're going to just talk about this very important issue, because the resurrection answers, I think, more questions than any other event in history. The resurrection answers the questions: does God exist? If he exists, does he care about me? Is he a personal God? Do miracles occur? And most importantly, how can I know if Christianity is the true religion or not? Because there's so many other religions out there. But before we get to answer any of those questions, first we need to answer the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? So we're going to talk about why we believe the answer to that question is yes. And having a verifiable miracle at its core is one of the most important differences between Christianity and other religions. Christianity has always said, this is how you can know that this religion is true. From as soon as the early church started, they always were proclaiming, this is the proof. For example, in Acts 17:31, Paul is speaking to the Athenians, and he says, God will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So what's the proof? Well, to determine if the resurrection actually happened, you only need to establish two facts. One, that Jesus died, and two, that he was alive again later. The first one is quite easy to establish, actually. Even the most skeptical and critical Jesus scholars will acknowledge that Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. The skeptical New Testament scholar, Gerd Ludemann, states, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Bart Ehrman, another skeptical New Testament scholar, is very popular among atheists, has said, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. And we know this not only from the reliable biblical sources, but the Roman historian Tacitus talks about this. Josephus, a Jewish historian, talks about this. Eusebius, Suetonius, the list goes on. Despite that, there's still this common claim floating around the internet that Jesus is a myth. Jesus never existed. And so if you're talking to a non-believer who says something like this is probably one of the easiest points of criticism to address. And hopefully just by gently correcting them and showing them, actually there's like a really good historical evidence to believe that Jesus existed. Hopefully that'll make them just question their worldview a little bit and just say, okay, well, maybe I was wrong about that, and just process that. What will invariably happen next is that the skeptic non-believer, or, maybe they belong to another religion, what they'll say is, okay, fine, I can acknowledge that Jesus existed as a person. But the Jesus of the Bible, this Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Messiah, that Jesus never existed. So you have to prove that Jesus existed. And that is exactly why the resurrection is so important. And to get this down is really one of the things that Christians should be focusing on. Because if Jesus did rise from the dead, then that means that his claims to being God and being the Messiah are validated. God has essentially given Jesus the stamp of approval by resurrecting him and not resurrecting Muhammad or Buddha or other figures. So the real question then is whether or not Jesus was alive again later, the second premise we're going to defend. To establish this fact, we have three separate pieces of evidence that we will present to you today. One, that there was an empty tomb. Two, there were multiple independent eyewitnesses to the resurrection. And three, most importantly, we know we can trust those eyewitnesses. So Arlene, I don't know if you want to jump in here and maybe talk about the empty tomb.
Yeah.
Thank you.
An empty tomb, of course, doesn't prove that anyone rose from the dead, but if you're going to claim a resurrection, you need an empty tomb. And so up to 75% of skeptical scholars will acknowledge that there was an empty tomb where Jesus had been laid. And the reason they'll acknowledge this is three factors. One, the story happened and was first reported in Jerusalem, where it happened. So if there had been a body in the tomb, it would have been easy enough for those who didn't want there to be a resurrection to have gone and said, no, look, here's the body. So the fact that it happened in Jerusalem. Secondly, you have enemies of the story attesting to the fact that the tomb is empty. When you have the Jewish leaders going, okay, what are we going to do? We need to pay somebody to lie about this and acknowledge that this tomb is empty, and we need a different story than that there was a resurrection. And the third factor is that the testimony of the women, they were the first ones to see the empty tomb. Now, why is that evidence for the story being true? It's kind of ironic, but in first century Judaism, the testimony of women was not considered to be reliable. In fact, they considered it to be on par with a robber. And so if you're going to make up a story and say, we're just going to tell a story about Jesus being risen and a tomb being empty, you wouldn't put women into the story as the first witnesses to it, because that would be embarrassing for your story. It would make your story sound less true. So ironically, that makes it more likely that this is true. The tomb was empty.
So Arlene, there are certain things that you're saying, the way that they told the story, the way that the story is recorded makes it more believable.
Mm-hmm.
But what if legends develop over time? And what if there really weren't eyewitnesses, and that over the centuries, story got passed on to story, and it gets elaborated and embellished every time it gets told, and eventually you have this fantastic story about a resurrection that never really happened.
All right.
Yeah.
Joel wants to jump in.
Yeah. So this is something I personally did believe. And this is probably one of the most common points of criticism that you're going to hear, is just that the New Testament's not reliable, right? It's written way later after the fact by people who aren't eyewitnesses. And so all of the stories in the Bible, it's not like they're history, so they would say. They're just legends, just like, you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh or some other ancient myth. So there's a big problem with that. First of all, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which record the life and events of Jesus of Nazareth and his actions, these are really early writings. So two of them, Matthew and John, were written by disciples. Matthew is probably written in Aramaic first, which was the regional language of Galilee, or at least it had many Hebrew isms if it was written in Greek. And so Matthew and John were both eyewitnesses to Jesus's death and resurrection, and so they would have had firsthand knowledge about what his life and teachings were. The other two Gospels, Luke and Mark, were written by compatriots of the disciples. Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. Mark recorded Peter's preachings in Rome, according to the earliest tradition of authorship. And so good scholarship would also date Matthew to around 10 to 30 years after the crucifixion happened, with the other Gospels not far behind. So it's important to remember that in ancient history, if you have one early source for an event, it's enough to establish that event as a fact. To have four early sources for an event is virtually unprecedented. I mean, scholars, like Greek scholars, would be salivating over this idea that we have four independent eyewitness sources for Plato or something like that. But we actually have more than that too, because we also have Paul's writings, and Paul's writings prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what the Christian church was teaching developed far too early for it to have been corrupted by legend. So I don't know, Arlene, if you have a few things to say about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's good for us to remember that even though Paul's writings come after the story of Jesus, in the writings of the New Testament, some of them are actually the earliest writings before the Gospels were written down. And so when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 writes to the Corinthians, he says, I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you. So he's referring back to when he was first in Corinth, which was around AD 51, which you in turn received, in which you stand, and you've been saved, and you're holding on to this message. And then he goes on to say, this is what I proclaimed to you. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received. And then he goes into what everybody recognizes as being an early Christian creed. Now, a creed is a statement of belief that's easily memorized and kind of summarizes things, and it's passed down to people, and everybody, you know, we recite the Apostles' Creed sometimes, and this was a creed. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. Well, when scholars are looking at what demonstrates the historical reliability of an event, early testimony that is close to the event in question is considered more reliable, obviously, than one received years after the event, because it doesn't leave time for legends to grow. And Paul wrote this in the mid-50s. He says he preached it to the Corinthians back in the early 50s, but he had received it earlier. He says, I passed on to you what I had received. So when did he receive it? Well, the best guess we have is an event he refers to in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, when 3 years after he had seen Christ on the road to Damascus, he'd gone into the wilderness for 3 years to study and pray and meditate maybe on scripture. And he came back and he went to Jerusalem. And he met with Peter and James, who were the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. Then he went out preaching. And after 14 years, went back again just to confirm that what he was preaching was the same message they were preaching. And they agreed, yes, it is. And so it seems very likely. And here again, even the skeptical scholars will acknowledge that this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 comes from likely within 3 years of the alleged resurrection of Jesus from his death. So within 3 years, the early church had already codified, this is what we believe, that Christ died, he was buried, he was raised to life on the third day, and that he appeared to many witnesses.
Yeah, I hear you guys, but some of my friends might say, what if they were deceived? What if they really wanted Jesus to be raised and had heard him promise it, and now he was dead, and so they kind of, they hallucinated.
Well, I think that some people might say that the disciples were just making up the story, right? Basically, that they must have perpetrated the greatest hoax of all time. You know, they just told everyone they were lying. They said, yeah, Jesus really came to us. Come join our religion. We know we're starting this exciting new movement.
Right. So you've got this creed within 3 years, but that's because they made it up and told
exactly.
everyone.
Yeah. So it's not legend, right? But maybe they just made it up, and they made it up like immediately after Jesus was crucified. So if that's going to be your line of criticism, you have to ask yourself, so what's the motivation for the disciples to do that? Yeah, because maybe they just really wanted Jesus's promises to be true. You see in the ancient world that there were lots of Messiah movements that, but as soon as they were stamped out, all of the followers of that movement just scattered, and the movement came to nothing. And it talks about that in Acts chapter 5, when the disciples are before the Sanhedrin. But more importantly, there is absolutely no financial or social incentive to perpetrate this hoax, because immediately after the disciples began preaching the gospel, the disciples came under severe persecution by the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish council of elders. And then eventually they came under heavy persecution by the Romans as well. Many of them were flogged and eventually killed for their conviction that they had seen and interacted with the risen Jesus. I'll just give you a brief overview of what early church history was like for these disciples. In Acts 4, Peter and John are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are arrested and flogged, which is whipped with barbed tips. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by King Herod. Paul's missionary life was characterized by hardships, and he was beheaded in AD 68. Andrew, the disciple, was martyred in AD 40. James, brother of Jesus, was stoned to death as a lawbreaker. Peter wanted to be crucified upside down, actually, because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified the way Jesus was crucified. And according to the tradition of the early church, he continued to preach to his executioners until he died. So what's the takeaway from all this? To put it in a pithy way, it's that liars make bad martyrs. Some human beings may be willing to die for the things that they believe in, but no person would be willing to die for something that they know is a lie. And the fact that not even one of the disciples recanted on their story is powerful evidence that the disciples weren't lying. And you see this well attested to in psychological literature. For example, studies have shown that people who are subjected to interrogation techniques, that they will just say whatever the interrogators want them to say to end the torture. But none of the disciples were willing to do that. Even Paul, a Pharisee, who was a persecutor of the Christian church, suddenly became a Christian himself and had a radical transformation. where he went from persecuting the church to being the author of over half of the books in the New Testament. So there clearly must have been some transformative experience, which was the cause of that.
Okay.
But, you know, if you're skeptical like I was, and this is the response that I had, you would say, yeah, sure. I mean, so what if they were willing to die for what they believed in? Lots of people are willing to die for the things they believe in. Just look at Islamic jihadists or Buddhist martyrs. They're willing to die for what they believe in. So what makes the Christian martyr so special? Well, there's a really, really important distinction to make here when it comes to the Christians. The difference is that martyrs for other religions die for something that they were taught. It's a tradition that's passed down to them. Whereas the disciples died for something that they either know is true or they know is false, because they're dying for a personal testimony that Jesus had appeared to them. And so even the most skeptical scholars, again, Gerd Ludemann, Bart Ehrman, you should get familiar with these names by now. Gerd Ludemann states, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman states, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. And Ed Parrish Sanders, another non-believing New Testament scholar, says that that Jesus's followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to those experiences, I do not know.
Right. So I think it's important to stress that these skeptical scholars are accepting that the disciples had some kind of an experience that they interpreted as being Jesus had risen from the dead. These skeptical scholars are not saying they believe Jesus rose from the dead, but they do say the disciples believed Jesus had risen from the dead. So then you have to explain why the disciples thought they had seen Jesus alive. And
okay, so let's say that there were people that really believed to the point of dying that this Jesus rose from the dead. But what if they didn't actually see Jesus like in bodily form? What if they hallucinated?
Yeah.
And I pointed that earlier, but what if they did?
I know you have hallucinations on the mind. You must have been reading Gerd Ludemann, because that's what he thinks. So, yeah, I mean, this is a hypothesis that's put forth, right? Because you have to explain what the nature of these experiences were. And so they'll say, oh, well, the disciples were just hallucinating. Lots of problems with that. First of all, Jesus appeared to many different people at many different points in time. Some of these people were friendly. Other people were enemies, like Paul and James, who was actually skeptical of Jesus. And most importantly, Jesus appeared to groups of people at the same time, and they together had this collective experience of interacting with Jesus. And there's nothing in the medical literature which suggests that group hallucinations can occur. Because a hallucination is necessarily something which occurs in the milieu of your own mind. It's like saying, you know, I'm having this great dream, come join me in my dream. It's not possible, because a dream happens exclusively in your mind, as does a hallucination. Even there's a phenomenon called mass hysteria, maybe you've heard of, which is also called a group sociogenic illness. But even with mass hysteria, people hallucinate different things, even if they're hallucinating at the same time. So hallucinations can't account for the multiplicity and the nature of these group appearances. Furthermore, medical doctor Joseph Bergeron states that hallucinations are caused by mental illness, right? It's not like you just have a hallucination for no reason. The hallucination is a symptom of a deeper underlying issue. The problem with that is that clearly the disciples were not mentally ill. It would take someone of a sound mind to orchestrate the rapid expansion of a new religion to the point where by AD 60, right, less than 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Emperor Nero had already launched this mass campaign of Christian persecution because the problem was getting so out of control. And so if you're not of a sound mind, no one's going to believe you, and you won't be able to orchestrate the rise of the early church. And thirdly, hallucinations would only convince first century Jews that the spirit of Jesus had appeared to them.
Yeah.
If you have a hallucination, there's no reason to believe that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. Even people who suffer from bereavement hallucinations, they don't believe that their deceased spouse has risen from the dead. They understand that they're mentally ill and that this is a hallucination. Mm-hmm. And finally, this hypothesis does absolutely nothing to explain the evidence of the empty tomb that we discussed earlier. Mm. And so if you want to be a proponent of the hallucination hypothesis, now you have to come up with a completely independent natural explanation just to explain why the tomb was empty. If you know what the principle of parsimony is, or Occam's razor, it's that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. So we don't want to multiply all of these ad hoc assertions in order to maintain a naturalist explanation. So there's only one cogent conclusion to draw from the facts that even non-believer scholars will regard as historically certain, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. Yet many people will still deny this. Even after all the evidence we've given you, people will still deny it. So why? To be frank, it's because people have a prior commitment to naturalism. So I'll define that term for you. Naturalism, simply put, is the worldview that nature is all there is, and that the supernatural does not exist. So to a naturalist, any supernatural explanation, such as a miracle, would be ruled out as a candidate before the investigation even begins. So is a commitment to naturalism a good reason to doubt the resurrection? Or as C.S. Lewis calls it, the grand miracle? Well, there's a glaring problem for the naturalist, and that's the global abundance of miracle claims. In 2006, the Pew Research Forum issued a report entitled Spirit and Power, a 10-country survey of Pentecostals, discussing statistics from charismatic Protestants in the US, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, India, the Philippines, and South Korea. The research found that around 200 million in just those countries claim to have witnessed miraculous healings, and that is not counting other kinds of Christians or Christians in other countries. Consider, for example, the miracle reports in China. According to Edmund Tang in his study of the grassroots Christianity movement in China, all Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. In fact, according to some surveys, 90% of new believers cite healing as a reason for their conversion. This is especially true in the countryside, where medical facilities are often inadequate or non-existent. After reviewing a number of miracles from around the world, Craig Keener, in his book entitled Miracles, says, "It is no longer plausible to tout uniform human experience as a basis for denying miracles. Hundreds of millions of claims would have to be satisfactorily explained in non-supernatural terms for this appeal to succeed." So what's Craig Keener saying here? Basically, he's saying that if even one miracle claim is true, then the naturalist is wrong. And if miracles are even possible, then we have to consider the resurrection hypothesis as a valid hypothesis to explain facts. So sorry, yeah, that was a mouthful.
Okay.
And a mindful.
Well, let me try and summarize the arguments we've been talking about. Number one is the tomb was empty, and the Jerusalem factor, the enemy attestation, and the testimony of women is convincing for that. Secondly, we have eyewitness accounts, and some of those eyewitnesses were hostile or skeptical, like James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, who was persecuting the church up until he saw Jesus risen. Thirdly,
just going to interrupt there. So the idea that some people really wanted this story to be true made it up. They didn't all want it to be true. Some wanted it to be wrong or false.
Yes.
They wanted to crush the movement.
One was persecuting Christians for preaching that the resurrection had happened.
Okay.
And then you have the early accounts, including especially that creed in 1 Corinthians 15, but also the Gospels being early, and the fact that these eyewitnesses truly believed they had seen the risen Jesus. And so we can trust their testimony. Naturalistic explanations for these facts fall short. And the reason this matters, and we'll talk more about this next week, but I just want to say that for Christians who face doubts or questions, and maybe it sometimes comes from friends, and sometimes maybe it's just your own doubts about faith and the Bible and so on. But if something that's right at the core of what you believe as the resurrection of Jesus is, can be historically proven, then that can give you greater assurance in what you believe. And so that matters. But I want to throw it back to Joel with that question then of why do naturalists still deny the resurrection even when faced with this evidence?
Yeah, I mean, it's naturalists. It's also maybe people who have a prior commitment to another worldview.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think, it's kind of obvious in a way. It's because of the unsettling implications of the resurrection, right? Because if the resurrection is true, then that means that Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, then that means my whole life has to change. If Jesus is Lord, now I have to give up all of these things I'm holding on to, all of my desires, my desire to be free. I don't want there to be a God, because then, I have to answer to something that's greater than myself. And so I think that's what's going on at the subconscious level for an atheist. I know for myself, let's say in 2017, I had a debate with my brother who was a Christian at the time. And
still is.
Yeah, I mean, at the time of 2017, I had the debate, right? Yeah, he hasn't apostatized or anything. He's a pastor at the Bridge Church. You should check it out. He's a really great pastor there. Anyway, so I was having this debate with him. I was really huffed up with pride. I'm in university studying philosophy. I'm bearing my existential dread. I'm trying to get to the real answers and not copping out for some fairy tale like you are. And yet when I'm debating him, he's giving me like all these really good reasons to believe that Christianity is true. And it really bothered me because I didn't have any response for these sort of claims. No matter how many times I tried to come up with an explanation, I just couldn't do it. So I think that admitting these facts was a really crucial step for me on my journey to faith. But for you to cross over into Christian theism, for you to break that barrier, because apologetics will only get you so far. To say that Jesus is Lord, I think, like I did, anyone needs to have a personal encounter with the living God. So, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, yeah, that's all well and true, but, I just can't bring myself to believe it. I would encourage you to just bow your head and ask God, hey, if you're real, just please reveal yourself to me. I found that I have full confidence that he's faithful to answer these sort of prayers. He's waiting for someone to knock at the door so that he can open the door for you and show you what's true. So if you're open to this at all, I just encourage you to, just say that little prayer, asking God, if you're really out there, just please show yourself to me and he'll answer.
Thank you, Joel, Arlene, for engaging us so well with passion, with your own personal journey. And it is what we've talked about today is that the Christian faith, believing in the bodily resurrection of our risen Lord, is a reasonable faith. And it has profound implications. And that's what we'll talk about next Sunday is, since the resurrection is true, what does it mean? And it means some wonderful things for us who believe. And so join us again next Sunday. But we want to close now with a song. And maybe for you, it's a song to get up, to stand, to raise your hands, and to thank God that he has shown himself to you and that he is present with you in your life, in your good times and your bad times. But maybe it's also maybe you're not there. And maybe it's time to do what Joel encouraged us to do, is to just quietly sit and then to deepen our hearts to say, God, if you are real, if this is true, will you show it to me? And God will be faithful. So let's listen to this song with thanksgiving or with quiet meditation.